Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Social Housing Roundtable. Lovely to see so many people with us straight away, and really, I'd say looking forward. I think today is going to be a very, very powerful session. And what I will say straight off the bat is that if anybody makes any comments or raise any points that they would like removing from the recording, please just let me know afterwards. I'll make sure that's done before we go live later. I want this to be a safe space and a respected space for all. To those who don't know me, to those who are new to the Social Housing Roundtable, a big welcome. My name is Matt Baird. I have been running this now for the best part of 3 years. The idea is to bring people together for informal discussions every week. So we do this every Tuesday, 11 till 12, on a wide array of topics. I think we've done about 120 something of these now. I need to check out the exact numbers. But it's great to have so many of you with us. The idea is that I guess a lot of the conferences and people things go to, we don't always get the chance to either have the conversational piece afterwards or just can't afford to go to everything. So these are always open. And as I say, if you ever want to check out the recordings, you can find the entire backlog on YouTube and Spotify. So this whole venture is run because I have worked in recruitment now for 11 years in social housing, and it's that part of my business which keeps this running for free. So if you are ever looking for somebody to support on your recruitment journey, please do reach out, because the more of you that use me for that, the longer we can keep these running. And I do just want to say a thank you to ATICC for sponsoring this year's season of the Social Housing Roundtable. So to today, I'm going to pass over to Lindsay Smith in just a second, who's going to introduce today's topic, today's themes. As I've already mentioned, there are some potentially some triggering topics, potentially some quite difficult conversations. If you wish to remain anonymous, either let me know and I can take things out the chat, or just write a message on the chat block to me anonymously. I will raise your point and will never mention your name. We will be talking about mental health. We will be talking about suicide. We will be talking about trauma. So I'm going to pass across to Lindsay, who has been recommended to me as an expert in this field. So it's lovely to have you with us today. And I will pass over to you to start today's presentation and I guess bring forth a conversation that, as we were talking about before we joined today, needs to be had more and more if we're ever to kind of combat the problems that we're having in wider society currently. So Lindsay, over to you.
Thank you so much, Matt. I'm just going to share my screen. Can everyone see my screen?
Not at the moment.
Not at the moment. Oops.
It's worked in practice, so we know it.
Yeah, we know that it did work. There's screen one. What about now?
No, I haven't got anything.
Oh, gosh. So we really did...
This was working just a moment ago, so give us a minute, everybody. We'll get it fixed. I say in the practice, it worked immediately. So
yeah, it did. Let me just take all of these screens down.
That's loading now. I've got your email up in front of us.
I took it all down. There you go. How's that?
Yeah, just go to display settings and because at the moment we can see your the next slide. No, that was fine.
Okay, let me swap screens then. How's that one?
No, you can just see your background at the moment. It was working where you were before. I was just literally saying was to change the view as we did before. So go back into your PowerPoint. It should load up again.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's the one. And then was it display settings at the top?
Yeah, and swap.
There we go. Perfect. Fantastic. Cheers, Lindsay.
Perfect. All right, lovely. So good morning, everyone. As you can see, my name is Lindsay Smith, and I am a psychotherapist and have been working in this field for, you can see my grey hair, for a very long time. Joe, you're having a nice little laugh there. One day you'll have a tea. Oh, you have. It's just got nice blonde bits in it. Yeah. All right. So exactly as Matt said, we're talking about three really, really sensitive subjects. So the first one is trauma, the second one is mental health, and the third one is about suicide. And whenever we speak about such sensitive subjects, it's very, very normal for you to feel triggered or for you to feel uncomfortable. But I don't want you to feel overwhelmed. So those of you that have experienced trauma, have experienced any kind of mental health issues, or have experienced somebody in your life or yourself who may have felt suicidal or perhaps even attempted suicide, please do not feel overwhelmed. If you do, please will you get with somebody who is supportive to you. So just give me the thumbs up if that's okay. If you commit to looking after yourselves, great, that's fantastic. All right, so we're going to start off with, I want you to look at the chat. So most people are very, very familiar with the term PTSD, but many people are not too sure about what CPTSD means, or complex PTSD. So I want you to write in the chat, if you're familiar with it, write yes. I want to see how many of you are familiar with this term. So 3, 4, 5. So about 6 of you. So 6 of about 36 people are familiar with it. So you can see that the vast majority of people are not familiar with the term and perhaps a bit confused about what it means. So I'm going to unpack that for you today in our little session. So when we look at complex post-traumatic stress disorder, it is about long-term trauma. It's not about short-term trauma. So PTSD comes from short-term trauma, whereas CPTSD, or complex post-traumatic stress disorder, comes from long-term traumas. So let's have a little look at what kind of long-term traumas. So ongoing domestic violence or abuse. So I want you to think about the housing that you are working in. So either you're providing it, or you're housing officers, or perhaps you're part of the housing association. Think about how many people living in social housing have experienced domestic violence and domestic abuse. So there is one issue. Can you see that it's long-term? The second one is that they repeatedly witness violence or abuse. So people who live in very, very violent communities where there's lots of gangs, there's lots of stabbings, there's lots of people fighting with one another, they also experience long-term trauma. Then we talk about the people who are being forced or manipulated into prostitution, and that has been quite a lot on the news recently, especially sort of in the communities where there is a lot of violence that is going on. So those same communities, people who've experienced torture or kidnapping or slavery, and slavery has also been in the news quite a bit recently, and being a prisoner of war. So those are the adults that may experience complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, the most common cause of complex post-traumatic stress disorder is childhood abuse. So we're going to look at that in a little bit more depth than the adult complex post-traumatic stress disorder. And I'm going to introduce you to something called ACEs. So again, in the chat, if you know what ACEs are, if you've heard anything about them, just pop in the chat, yes. Let's see how many of you are familiar with ACEs. Right. So very few of you. All right, let me unpack that a little bit. Now, why do we separate out adults and long-term trauma and children with long-term trauma? And I want you to look on my slide. Can you see in big capital letters? Is because the child is still developing. So their brains and their bodies are still developing. And when they experience this long-term trauma, it impacts on their development. So let's have a little look at these things called ACEs. So it stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences, and we break it down into physical, sexual, or verbal, as well as neglect or abandonment. So I'm going to take you into just a very, very brief overview of what these ACEs look like. And again, keep in mind that ACEs negatively impact the development of the child. So there are 3 focal areas of ACEs. So we look at all three of those focal areas. The first area is abuse. The second area is neglect. And the third area is a dysfunctional household. So here we go. This is area number 1, and this is what we call overt abuse, which means that it is done to the child. Okay, so it could be physical abuse, it could be sexual abuse, but it could also be verbal, emotional, or psychological abuse. So that's area number 1. Area number 2 is neglect. And this is what we call covert abuse, which means it's stuff that's withheld from the child. So abuse is done to the child, neglect is withheld from the child. So the kinds of things like emotional neglect is they don't get love, they don't get support, they're ignored. And then with physical neglect, they don't get good food, no good housing, they don't get medication if they're ill, perhaps their nappies are never changed, that kind of thing. And then the last area, which is the largest area, is a dysfunctional household. No, it's not clicking. There you go. All right, so these are the things that fall under the dysfunctional household. So if there's any alcoholism or drug abuse in the home, and it's not necessarily the parents, it could be grandparents, uncles, aunts, it could be siblings. So any child who is living with alcoholism or drug addiction within the home will experience that trauma. If there is anyone who is mentally ill at home, and obviously the worse the mental illness, the greater the trauma is going to be on the child. If they visibly see their mother being treated violently in the home, if a household member has been imprisoned, and again, it doesn't have to be the parents only, it can be any one of the household. And many schools have done research on this, and what they found is if their siblings are in jail, so those kids that are living in areas where there's lots of gangs, their siblings often go to jail. And then the last one is if they've had a loss of a biological parent before the age of 18. And this could be from divorce or separation, or it could be if the parent died. There definitely are cases of the father being treated violently, but what the research has found is that the trauma is much worse if they see the mother being treated violently. I don't know why, I'm just telling you what the research says, but it's something that we can unpack. All right, so if you look at this document, you can see that there are 10 ACEs, and the research was done on these 10 ACEs. And what they found is that the greater the number of ACEs that a child experienced, the greater the risk of the negative health outcome. Okay, so the greater the number, the greater the risk. Now, I didn't say that it would happen. I said that it is a risk. So there are always compensating factors, okay? So just look at this as a risk of these things happening. So there are 3 areas of impacts because of childhood trauma. So we're going to look at those 3 areas. So the first is physical, then social, then psychological. Now, obviously, psychological is going to lead us into the second topic that we're going to talk about today, and that is mental health. So let's look at the physical first. All right, now I know it's really, really small, but what I want you to see is that the brain of the child that lives in a traumatic environment, the frontal lobe is underdeveloped, and what we call the amygdala is overdeveloped. Now, why is that so incredibly important? Is because the frontal lobe is our executive lobe. It's where we are logical, rational, make decisions, problem solve. So I want you to imagine the child that has got an underdeveloped frontal lobe. They make unwise decisions. They can't problem solve creatively. And can you imagine carrying that through into adulthood and what the impacts of that will be? Now let's talk about the amygdala. The amygdala is the emotion center. Now, how many of you have said, why is that person so oversensitive? Or they're so oversensitive and they're always overreacting. Yeah, you know that some people are like that. It means that their amygdala is overdeveloped. So it means that when people who have not experienced an overdevelopment of the amygdala would react this much. If they have an overreactive amygdala, they would react like this much. Okay, and it's not something that they choose, it's not something that they control, it just happens because it's part of the nervous system. The second one that I want to bring up is this one here called neurotransmitters. Now, I've spoken about three here: dopamine, oxytocin, and serotonin, which are the three that are most common in mental illness. The last one, which is endorphins, is about pain relief. Now, what you'll find is that people who experience trauma as a child, and they have now got complex post-traumatic stress disorder, they experience more pain than people who haven't. So they'll get more headaches, and their headaches will be worse. Even their skin, they say, is very, very sensitive to touch. They have much more backache, headaches, and sort of non-specific aches and pains. All right, so that's the neurotransmitters. The next one is hormones. I'm not going to touch a lot about that, but their hormones are negatively impacted. And it has negative impacts on their hormonal development, on puberty, etc. Waste elimination, so this is the bowels and the bladder. You'll know that, I'm sure you've all heard of very stressed kids will be wetting the bed, having accidents, take much longer to do toilet training, that kind of thing. But let's go back to the brain. Neural pathways are the ways in which our mind develops pathways. So when something happens, and it happens often enough, we develop a particular response to that particular thing. So children who live with this long-term trauma develop maladaptive neural pathways. So their thinking patterns are maladaptive. Okay, somebody's asking some questions. So Matt, I'll leave that to you. And so this is the key in people who have experienced it, is that in the late 90s, we developed MRIs and CT scans, and we learned that there is something called neuroplasticity, which means that we are not stuck with those ways of thinking. Okay, now before that, we used to think that, oh, well, that's the way it is. There's nothing that we can do about it. Now, when we get to the psychological component of today's session, you'll see that neuroplasticity is retraining our brains to think in a different way. So that is a good positive for today. The nervous system, why all of these things happen is that when children feel really under threat, they have high levels of cortisol and high levels of adrenaline. And so those high levels is what damages the rest of their body. So it damages their thinking, and it damages all of these different components of the physical body. Their immune system is also damaged. I don't know if any of you have heard of that people who have got above 4 ACEs, they are at risk of their life ending 20 years earlier than other people. And then the last one is about these high levels of adrenaline and cortisol cause cellular changes. So right at the very, very bottom, the base of our nervous system, there are cellular changes. And this is what causes what we call nervous system dysregulation. So that's what we're going to head into when we look at the psychological component. All right, so those are all the physical components, and I've gone through it very, very quickly because we're not going to stay there. Now, how that all plays out in adulthood, and this is what you may have seen, that all of these things are results of that damage that was done to the developing brain and body of the child who was living with those stresses in early childhood. Okay, now let's look at the social impacts of trauma. So what you're going to see here is that this is the social network that a child is born with, and around them, as they start developing these over-emotional responses, as they start either becoming aggressive or becoming withdrawn, then we have what is called social thinning. So if you see around the person that nobody wants to be close to them, and so they start moving away from them, and you'll find that they only have peripheral people in their social support system, not very, very close. Now, if you think about how do we feel when we don't have people that are really close to us, that are prepared to support us through thick and thin? And so there's lots and lots of impacts that happen to the person. So they begin to realize other people are avoiding me. They begin to realize that people don't like me, that I don't have many friends, and that starts them on this loneliness and lack of social support. And what the research shows us is that the more lonely somebody is, the smaller their social support system is, the higher their risk is of mental health issues. Okay, so just know that each topic that I bring up, I could do a day's session on each of those things. All right, now let's look at the psychological impacts of trauma. And that's the link that we're bringing: trauma, mental health problems, and finally to suicide. So people who have suffered with long-term trauma are at very high risk of developing one or more, and usually we find that they have 2, 3, or even 4 diagnosable mental disorders. So the most common that you may come across are anxiety disorders. So anxiety is not just one disorder, there are many anxiety disorders. The second one is depressive disorders, then personality disorders. And then at the bottom here, you have something called ADHD. Now, a lot of people are misdiagnosed with either a personality disorder or ADHD, where in fact they have got complex post-traumatic stress disorder. So there's a whole lot of debate going on at very, very high levels about this misdiagnosis that many, many people might have been diagnosed with ADHD or a personality disorder, but perhaps have CPTSD, not those. They may have all 3, but they're looking at those diagnoses. Okay, so if we look at this diagram here, you will see that this is childhood experiences versus adult chronic depression. And if you look at the bottom here, you'll see that this is people with no ACEs in their lives. But if you look at this over here, you will see that these are people with 4 or more ACEs in their lives that experience chronic adult depression. Now, the black bars are females and the blue bars are males. And it's a very, very interesting statistic, is that why do males have much smaller percentages of chronic depression than females? And what the research shows is that it is females that are much more, how do I say this? They've been sexually abused. So females have a very, very high rate of sexual abuse, whereas males have a higher rate of physical abuse and psychological abuse. So you will see that sexual abuse brings a very, very high level of chronic depression. Okay, so we're going to look now at the symptoms of complex post-traumatic stress disorder. And as we're going through this, I saw one comment about ASD. I want you to think about people, residents, or people in your family or friends that you might have had difficulties with. So people will say, oh, they're so difficult, or why do they overreact? So I want you to think about these people. As I go through, now these are diagnostic criteria that you will find in the International Diagnostic Classifications. So let's have a look. So the first one that you might come across is they have great difficulty controlling their emotions. So these are the kinds of things you'll have. You'll tell them something that they possibly don't like, and you'll have this massive angry outburst coming at you. And you think, wow, that is like really beyond what the person should be reacting for or by. They might cry uncontrollably, or they might jump between shouting and screaming and crying. And so very, very often they're described as being overreactive or over emotional. And you can see that if people are behaving like this, that social thinning will happen. People will avoid them. The next diagnostic criteria is that they feel very angry and very distrustful of the whole world. Everyone is out to get them. Everyone is doing them wrong. Nobody understands them. So that distrust comes from because when they were little, you expect that those adults in your life would look after you, and they haven't. So they distrust anyone, especially people in positions of power. So this leaves them with constant feelings of emptiness and hopelessness. And so we're going to look at, this is one of the high predictors of suicidal thoughts, that when people feel hopeless, that nothing is ever going to get better, nothing is ever going to change for them, it is one of the critical things in suicidality. The next diagnostic criteria is that they feel as if they're permanently damaged and they have no worth. So if you want to do something nice for them, they're suspicious of that. Why are you doing that? They feel like they're not worthy of you doing something good for them. And they have this terrible sense of shame and guilt that they are damaged goods and they don't deserve anything. So very often you'll find them end up in abusive relationships because they have such a sense of, I'm damaged, I'm worthless, I deserve all of this terrible treatment. They know that they're different. Very often they'll say to you that they recognize this in childhood or even as teenagers, that they've always seen that they're different to other people. And they really feel like nobody understands what's happened to them. And probably people that haven't been through that can't understand what's happened to them. So they might avoid friendships and relationships, or they might find their friendships and relationships very, very difficult. They often experience dissociative symptoms. All right, so let's explain a little bit about dissociation. So when they're in a situation that makes them feel triggered, they just numb or they withdraw from those situations. And so it's almost like they're outside of their situation. So I'm going to talk a little bit about something that a lot of rape victims will express. They'll say that when I was being raped, it was as if I was out of my body and I was looking down at myself. Have any of you heard of that kind of thing? Yeah. So what they're doing is they're dissociating from the terrible trauma that is happening to them. Now, that is a great thing whilst you're in the trauma, but if you develop dissociation for the rest of your life, it's not a good way to work through life because you dissociate from the very people that you need some social support with. And then you'll have all kinds of physical symptoms. I already alluded to that. So they have more headaches than anyone, more dizziness than anyone. They have chest pains, backaches, stomach aches, all kinds of stomach problems, and lots of exhaustion. And you'll find that they'll go from doctor to doctor to doctor with all of these kinds of symptoms, and they won't get any specific diagnosis. And it's because of their nervous system dysregulation that has occurred and damaged their bodies at a very, very early age. So if you just have a little look at that list of diagnostic criteria, remember, these are not my criteria. They come out of the international classification of diagnosing complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, the last one that I'm going to introduce to you is that they have regular suicidal feelings. So can you imagine living with all of these issues? Life cannot be nice. And so when they just feel hopeless about anything changing, they then have regular suicidal feelings and regular suicidal ideas.
This episode of the Social Housing Roundtable is sponsored by ATICC. ATICC helps as many people as possible feel safe, connected and informed by combining ingenious technology and award-winning human contact. Alertical's digital engagement solution helps social landlords proactively know their customers and properties by putting a portable touchscreen in every home, offering a daily property check through the optional OK Each Day service, plus repairs reporting, tenant surveys, and much more. They also provide Beyond Warden Calls, an easier, simpler, and lower-cost wireless warden call solution with video door entry, dispersed telecare, and smoke alarms. Alertical works with over 60 housing providers across the UK to enhance two-way engagement between customers and landlords. In 2022, Alertical won the Queen's Award for Enterprise and Innovation, and in 2023 won Housing Supplier of the Year. I'm delighted to have them as our sponsor of the Social Housing Roundtable throughout 2024.
So if we look at the data, the research, what you will find is that 20 out of 100 people with 7 ACEs, which is a very high number of ACEs, will attempt suicide. Whereas only 1 out of 100 people with 0 ACEs will attempt suicide. So again, you will see that the number of ACEs increases the risk for people. So the last thing that we're going to look at is we're going to look at suicide itself. Now, suicide starts off with they're feeling very, very depressed, very hopeless, and things are not okay. And it will go up to starting to have passive suicidal thoughts. So that means I'm just thinking about suicide, but I'm not active about it. They then have suicidal thoughts, but with no active plan. Then it goes up to active suicidal thoughts. And then finally, the last stage is they actively prepare for suicide. Now, some people will take a long time to go through that, but other people can go through that very, very quickly. So something will happen and they will be triggered out of their depression and hopelessness right up to the top in very, very quick succession. So what we want to look at is you should never, ever leave somebody alone. James wants to say something. James, do you want to interrupt right here?
Jim,
if we bring you in after the end of the presentation, is that all right, pal?
Oh, yeah, sorry, right, fine.
No,
It's
that's
just
right,
that
I'll bring you
particular
in at the end,
sentence.
Dave.
I'm nearly finished, James. So just write down what you wanted to say so that you don't forget. Okay. So if somebody has active preparation for suicide and they say this to you, you don't ever leave them alone because it's really, really dangerous. So if possible, try and get them to go to A&E, call 999, call 111, and 111 might then call 999. If you know that they have registered with a mental health crisis care team in the community, then you could call them, or you could really advocate for the person to call them themselves. And most communities have got crisis centers in the community. But what you would need to do is you would need to find out, do you have a crisis service within your community? Now, most crisis services only stay open until about 11 at night. So if it's really, really late at night, after 11, then they would need to go to A&E, or you would need to get somebody to stay with them. And it depends on if they have social support people that will come and stay with them just to ensure that they're safe. If they have active suicidal thoughts, again, you wouldn't leave them, but you promote that they would call their GP, or again, the community crisis team if they're registered. If they're under a therapist, they need to send their therapist an emergency message that they are feeling suicidal. Try and get family members or friends to stay with them. And there's lots of crisis centers that have developed. There are things like crisis cafes, there are men's sheds. I don't know if you've heard about men's sheds. So there's lots of things that have sprung up that are there for people who have got active suicidal thoughts. When they're in this phase, they have no intention to act on their suicidal thoughts. They need to seek outpatient care so they can see that they're getting worse, they can see that they're not feeling very well, so either get back into therapy, and at this stage they should have developed a safe person, they should have developed a safety plan, And if they haven't, I can give you, you can just email me at the end and I can give you a safety plan that can be developed with them. If they're having passive suicidal thoughts, and I've had many, many patients who have told me that they've lived with passive suicidal thoughts for years, but they've never developed a plan, it's never become active. Okay, so, and remember that we're not talking about generally suicidal. We're talking about people that have got complex post-traumatic stress disorder, and they're feeling like this because of the traumas and the nervous system dysregulation that has never been treated. So the treatment of choice for complex post-traumatic stress disorder is something that we call trauma-based cognitive behavioral therapy. So it's different from normal cognitive behavioral therapy. It's trauma-based. And the therapy that has been found to have the best outcomes is something that we call EMDR, which stands for eye movement desensitization reprogramming. And it's to reprogram the brain out of that nervous system dysregulation. Then there is something that is very, very new in the field of therapy, and somatic therapy it's a therapy that is helping the body, the nervous system, to regulate rather than to stay in that dysregulated state. But also to get support from friends and family, to get into different hobbies, exercise, and we'll talk a little bit about exercise. So my daughter, who has since died, she was under the mental health team for years and years and years, and she would feel suicidal, and she would phone up and they would say, have you gone for a walk? Now, you can imagine how she felt about that. And I'm sure that a lot of you have heard that kind of thing. Or they would say, have a cup of tea. It will make you feel better. So we know that as a preventive methodology, exercise is good. But when somebody is in a suicidal crisis, you're not going to say to them, go and have some exercise, because that's just not the thing to do. All right, so be aware of what I'm saying. Exercise is more preventive. When somebody's in crisis or when they're deeply depressed, they don't even have the energy to get out of bed sometimes. All right, nature has been found to be a very, very therapeutic thing. And a lot of research came out during COVID, which is why the government allowed us to go walking in nature during COVID, be it 2 meters apart. And then the last one is the no suicidal thoughts, but depressed. And this is where I would like to promote that right up until about the 60s and 70s of the 1960s and the 1970s, people were promoted to self-help. And then medication, psychiatric medication, and visiting psychiatrists and psychologists became very, very sort of popular. And it's almost as if we took away our power. We took away power from people to do things to help themselves. And so people will go to the GP or they'll go to the psychiatrist and they will expect medication or they will expect talk therapy. And if they don't get it, they have this feeling of hopelessness and helplessness. So what somatic therapies are trying to do is to give that power back to people. So to end off today's session, there are 3 areas that all of us need to access. The first one is professional help in whatever form it comes. The second one is social support, friends, family, and there are, in most GP surgeries now, there are people called social prescribers. So just be aware of social prescription, and you may be able to find some help there. And then the last one is self-help. Now, I have got reams and reams of things that people can do to help themselves to regulate their nervous system, to help them to feel better whilst they're seeking social support and professional support. So if any of you need any of the information, just remember I've touched on 3 topics, which I could lecture on this for a whole week or a whole month, ideally. Just drop me an email. Matt's got my email. Yeah, Matt, you got my
Yeah,
email.
thank you very, very much, Lindsay, and thank you for everything. I'm going to leave that up there for a moment, especially for anybody who's also watching back on the recording. Jim, I'm going to bring you in, and then there's a few points that have come up on the chat. I know the chat's been interesting as well, but we are now open for questions, as Jim has done. If anybody would like to ask their question in person, feel free to raise hand. Alternatively, put your question in the chat and I will raise it. But for now, Jim, over to you.
Okay. Good morning, Lindsay. Thank you very much indeed for your time. I get a little bit angst because I always say to my doctor, I have been on anxiety and depression and stress chronic before it was fashionable. And there are a lot of people, having worked in psychiatric care, having worked in general wards, burns and plastics, specialing, and you can unfortunately find in some legal professions now, solicitors may choose an ism list to go down and say, rather than send the person away to a naughty boys home or to prison, is it likely you may be suffering from this? Are you exhibiting that? Almost feeding them a line to say, this is what you need to say not to go to prison. Would you agree that that a fair assessment in some cases, not all?
So Wales actually did some very, very good research on this. And what they found is that in both males and females, that anywhere between 90 and 96% of people in prison had 4 or more ACEs. So you can see that it really creates a lot of mental health problems and behavioral problems in people that have experienced it. So James, I don't think it will prevent them from going to prison. And if they do have the diagnosis, it's not going to prevent them from going to prison if they've done something prison worthy. But you might find that they might go to a high security psychiatric hospital to get treatment for this rather than going into prison.
Yeah, I've worked on home office units. I've worked as a psyche nurse. I've also, as I say, the old expression, you can't work in a paint factory without being splashed, brings to mind.
Yeah,
but certainly my concern now is the mental health of social housing officers and staff who may be taking the work home with them. Somebody can see these things going on, see how it's being promoted. A lot of MPs will use it as a forum to jump onto and beat the drum on. And my concern is that many of the housing staff now may be taking their work home with them because Joe Bloggs has said, I'm going to do this to myself. I need this straight away. And maybe, I don't say it's the case that it could be, but possibly it's going to affect their mental health more so with the increase of workload, and eventually take the work from social services and from policing and put it into the hands of social workers or people who, when I got my rent, I never envisaged going to my housing officer to ask, can you please tell me what's your diagnosis of me, or what do you think I should be doing? To me, it should just be for signposting anyway. Thank you very much indeed, Lindsay.
It's
Sorry, we had someone come off mute. Lindsay, I'll leave that with you.
Okay, so you're absolutely correct, Jim, is that